If the current operating system for society is failing, what could an alternative look like? In 2013, Jim Rutt, the former chairman of the world-renowned Santa Fe Institute, brought together a group of renegade thinkers for a series of meetings in Stanton, Virginia, to try to answer that question. The team ranged from complexity theorists to culture hackers and evolutionary biologists, all united by a conviction that the current system was unsustainable and probably self-terminating.
When I arrived at the Stanton meetings, the framing surrounded the shared recognition that I think characterized everybody in the room that civilization was on a dangerous track. Some of us believed the track to be fatal in the near term.
Initially, the plan was to create a new political party, the Emancipation Party. Over time, that shifted onto a different project, how to change the culture. It gained a title, Game B. Why do you think that name particularly stuck?
If you're unhappy with the status quo, then Game B has to be what the status quo isn't. So better the devil I don't know than the devil I know.
But in 2014, the project stalled. Jim Rutt said it went into spore mode. Recently, some of these spores have germinated with a new surge of interest in Game B. So what can be learned from what happened to the original project? I'd love if you could tell the story, like fairly concisely, but the story of Game B from the Emancipation Party to the meetings at Staunton, just as a sort of broad overview, and then we'll kind of delve down into the details of it.
All right, it goes back a little further to a document I wrote in, I think I published it April 2012, and I invited some people to read it and critique it, and developed some momentum and resulted in a meeting in Stanton, Virginia in September 2012, where we, 7 or 8 people said, what are we going to do? The world needs changing. My document was mostly about a new monetary system, but also included a new financial system, some ideas about new political systems, etc. And we decided, for better or for worse, to start a new political party, right? We didn't know dick about political parties. And we decided we'd start one anyway. And we started having, we're strong believers that face-to-face was where real stuff happened. I've long expressed the doctrine that there's a distinction between weak links and strong links. Weak links is mostly what you get online, though sometimes you get strong links from online. And strong links are mostly what you get face-to-face, so you can get weak links face-to-face too. But anyway, we decided to meet regularly every 6 to 8 weeks to do whatever it was we were going to do, and they became a series of meetings known as Stanton 1 through 5. And so the first one, we decided we're going to launch a party. I don't even know if we came up with the name at that point, but somewhere soon thereafter, we came up with the name Emancipation Party. We created a series of reforms, and we decided that we were going to call for a debt jubilee. Interesting, all that stuff, at least the later version of it, the January 2013 version of it, still up on the emancipationparty.org website if anybody's interested in looking at it. So anyway, I think in late November, early December, we launched the party out, marketed it to people we knew and whatever. Again, we were incompetent. Fairly quickly, we got a couple of hundred people to join, and we decided to make it like a 19th century European party where you had to pay dues, $20 a month. But we also allowed people to optionally select, I can't afford 20, I'll pay 5, as part of the model to avoid having to depend on fundraising and money bags, right? And so we quickly got a couple hundred people in, and then in January we took stock of where we were. And we said, we did pretty good with baby boomers, good enough that from an early test marketing perspective, it would say proceed. With Gen Xers, we did about half as well as we did with boomers, which from our marketing experience would have said, probably improvable by fine-tuning over a period of time to make it good enough to launch. And you often find version 0.8 products that the early marketing doesn't quite make sense, but it's close enough that you believe you can tweak it over a few months and get it to make sense. Millennials, there weren't Z's yet, millennials were a complete washout. We did not get a single millennial to join, not one. And we went back and talked to some millennials, and it was quite uniform that the idea of a political party was anathema. it was as if you had said cat shit, right? The Emancipation Party cat shit. And even though the reforms, as you'll see, are very progressive and millennial friendly, things like what we'd now call Medicare for all, UBI, ending the drug wars, radical transparency in finance, a whole bunch of cool new ideas you'd think millennials would like, at least progressive ones. The idea of calling it a political party was horrible, and asking for their subscription was also horrible. They assumed it had to be a scam. They couldn't figure out what scam it was, but they figured it had to be a scam. So anyway, we said, shit, launching a party to just appeal to millennials, to boomers, not a good idea. The future is young people. And if this thing won't appeal to millennials, then we should not proceed. So we basically stopped the limited marketing, the test marketing we were doing, and said, let's rethink what we're doing and how to do it better, or how to restructure it or respin it or promote it or rebrand it or something to appeal to millennials. And it was at that point, in a meeting, Stanton 3, in January 2013, that Jordan Greenhall at the time, now known as Jordan Hall, went to the whiteboard and started drawing a picture. And essentially he drew a fairly steep cone or pyramid or something, triangle probably, as the Emancipation Party. And then he drew broad ramps leading up to it. And he said, what we really need is a softer, less well-defined social movement that articulates some or many of the values of the Emancipation Party, but is not positioned as a political party and requires no contributions and requires no commitment to any action per se. And it will be a gradual on-ramp that will particularly designed to appeal to millennials, and will eventually get some of them at least ready to join the Emancipation Party. And that, what I would say, was the mental model of what eventually became Game B. That it was a social movement that incorporated a set of values, but wasn't strictly defined, and would appeal to young people, but would gradually move them along, eventually become ready to be more politically active. And then we sort of had a wild conversation for a goodly part of the rest of that meeting about, well, what this thing be, right? And we came up with I believe we came up with some principles of that meeting, which would include that it be non-hierarchical, that would be a fundamental value, that it would be network-centric, and that it needed to eventually lead to a social operating system that had long-term metastability, that it could exist for centuries at least. And interestingly, all three of those things to this day, I believe, are fundamental values in Neo Game B thinking. And it was quite interesting. And very rapidly became clear that the interest of at least a majority of the participants in this activity, which at that point was probably 25 or 30 people, more of them were interested in this social movement than were interested in the party. But interest in the party continued, through the rest, at least until September 2013. But it was very clear that this concept of this vague social movement is where the energy started to be. And it may well have been in one of those conversations that at that time, that the concept, in a generic sense, not a branded sense, is that Game A is the status quo and Game B is this new social movement, social operating system, sort of lack of a better term, essentially, and that we would position Game B as something that the world would eventually transition to, and that Game B would explicitly parasitize A to accelerate. There was certainly a fair amount of accelerationism in that early talking. And then that meeting ended, and the meetings ran from Friday evening, where we started with a dinner, to a full, long, intense day on Saturday, and then a half a day on Sunday that was mostly synthesis of what we had cooked on Saturday. And so we went home with this new concept in the air, and we continued to communicate as we always did on Basecamp. Basecamp went all the way back to September 2012 and was the main online community for the inner circle of the Emancipation Party, and then what became Game B. And we chattered away as we always did. As I was telling David, there's probably at least 10,000 posts on Basecamp. Might be 100,000. It's a whole bunch. We chattered away way too much probably. And during this time, this vague idea started getting some legs on it, and that Stanton 4, which happened in April 2013, Jordan Greenhall at that point, now Hall, gave a presentation, which I don't believe he was still yet calling it Game B, but it was very much more meat on the bones of what we now call Game B, and it also developed a lot of support, and et cetera. At the same time, or soon thereafter, again, let's look at the timeline, Thor Muller made the explicit suggestion that we brand the whole effort Game B. Earlier, Game B had been sort of a generic comparison of where we're from, Game A, to where we're going, Game B, but it was thought to be just a talking point, internal generic, and not for brand. And Thor was the one, I believe, who decided that it should be branded Game B, proposed that, and there was some discussion, as there always was, and everything that had to do with the community, but it fixed pretty quickly. That people said, okay, let's go with that. Then from that point forward, through May and June, we started to ramp up the community, mostly focused on Game B. In fact, almost all the new people that came in to the inner community were more interested in Game B than they were in the Emancipation Party, though there were still a dozen or so stalwarts, including me, still interested principally in the party. And then the Basecamp site kept getting busier and busier and busier, and then some fissures started to appear in the community, which are interesting. I don't know if we want to talk about that separately, but maybe we should. So anyway, fissures started to appear, conflict, different views, strongly felt, ugly fights, and over that summer, essentially the community as a intense operating entity started to unwind. The last Stanton meeting was Stanton 5 in June of 2013. We had said there'd be a Stanton 6 in August. It never happened. We tried some other pivots, but and then I think probably in January 2014 declared the thing to be done. And I think I used the words, it's time for us to go into spore mode, where we've all learned a lot from each other and have co-created a whole bunch of things, even if we don't agree with them all, agree with each other about everything. So it is now time for us to go back into the world, live our lives, do our thinking, and some of us will probably continue working on Game B-ish things or not. And perhaps in the future, Game B will come back to life. And interestingly, I don't know, in the last 3, 4, 5 months, Game B has come back to life. I thought it was I don't know. I knew it was possible, but if you'd asked me in January 2014, what's the chances? I would have said less than 50-50 probably, but way higher than zero. And for some reason, it started to rebubble pretty substantially, and interesting, a lot of it independent of the original Game B people over on Twitter. If you want to see what they've been up to, search on hashtag Game B or just Game B by itself, and you'll find all kinds of people that nobody in the Stanton meetings community had ever known. And I think there are a lot of them were driven by listening to podcasts and reading documents and stuff. So that's very short, mostly short form of the history of Game B. Though I should say that Jordan, now Hall, had continued to work Game B. In fact, he asked me at the time we went to sport mode, what should he work on? And I told him Deep Code, which was a name he may have come up with, but was the idea of thinking as deeply as you can about the philosophical principles of what we're doing. And he's continued to publish under the name Deep Code on Medium, and has written a lot of really good things. He then later met 2 people out where he lives in Southern California, Daniel Schmattenberger and Forrest Landry. And the 3 of them have done some very good work and they have explicitly branded it Game B, and have been on lots of podcasts, have written some documents, some blog posts, et cetera, some Medium posts, which I call this the San Diego interpretation of Game B. And it is, and while it's the one that's furthest along, I think it's important for people to know that it is not the definitive Game B, and they would be the first to admit that Game B is still very undercooked and underdefined, but they have put some stakes in the ground, and I think they're very useful bits of work that they've done. And I would point people that are interested in learning more about the current thinking of Game B to look at the San Diego interpretation, but realize that it's one interpretation amongst many, and by no means fully defines what Game B could or should be.
What was the initial framing of the whole enterprise when you first came into it?
So when I arrived at the Stanton meetings, the framing surrounded the shared recognition that I think characterized everybody in the room that civilization was on a dangerous track. Some of us believed the track to be fatal in the near term. And the question was, could we figure out some alternative trajectory that was not only better, but that was accessible from where we were at that time in history, which would have been about 2013.
And do you think everyone who was part of the initial project recognized those sort of stakes, or recognized it as that kind of civilizationally important project?
I think the degree of recognition varied a lot. I think everybody recognized that there was something concerning about the way civilization presently runs, and maybe everybody in the room would recognize that it was dangerous. But the necessity to do something was, a subset of us recognized the urgency of it.
And what was achieved, like in the first few meetings? What did you feel was achieved?
Well, I think all of these kinds of projects have the same initial trajectory, which is you have to teach each other to speak your language, to see things that are particularly clear from your vantage point, and you have to let them do the same. And if that fails, then you don't have a project. And if that succeeds, then you can begin to build on the shared understanding. There's no way to skip that phase. And so, unfortunately, we didn't have enough time together to get much past it, but I think we did a lot of work building a shared understanding and figuring out what direction that we would need to head.
And the name Game B, is that a reference to sort of game theory, and Game A being the kind of civilization we have at the moment, Game B being a sort of placeholder for something new? Was the name chosen because it represented kind of the game theoretic constraints of kind of a civilization as it is?
Well, I can't say why the name was chosen. I became aware of it. Jordan gave a presentation at the board, and it roughly laid out that we live in something that we would loosely call Game A, and that we needed to go somewhere called Game B. And basically the idea was there was so little content in that name that it could work almost no matter what our priors were about the situation we live in and the fact that we needed to do something new. I do think whether it was intentionally a reference to game theory or not, an effort to figure out how civilization functions and what alternative might exist ultimately comes down to your ability to take away all of the layers of meaning that we impose on our system to understand how it does function, which would inherently be analogous to some sort of game, and that a system that we arrived at would also inevitably fit into the same rubric. So really, maybe that name is just evidence of our shared understanding that there was a project and its basic nature would be to look at the rules of our current system and to rework them in such a way that our system would function better.
And how would you summarize that for you? What are the failure conditions of Game A versus what does Game A need to be? Or what does Game B need to be?
Well, you know, I was brought in because there was an awareness that there was something evolutionary about the whole question and that they needed someone to speak to it rather directly. And the way I would phrase the problem is this. we have a tendency as humans to solve problems, and we solve them at all sorts of different scales, whether it's little inventions that reduce the amount of work involved in some sort of objective, or whether we are architecting cities or civilizations or whatever, what have you. And the problem is that when we build these things, in large measure because our history of building such things is pre-Darwinian, we are not aware that we are building an entity that will evolve according to whatever niche space it finds itself in. And so if you look at, for example, the American experiment was architected by highly intelligent people who understood more or less what their objectives were, but they were prior to the origin of species, and so they did not recognize that in constructing this entity, they were also building something that would morph, and whatever their intentions had been at first would be inevitably swallowed by the system of incentives that surrounded the project, and that ultimately we would find out what that niche space looked like because the entity they were building would explore it. So I think we've done this time and time again. We've done it politically, we've done it economically, where we've set up a system, we've said what we wanted, and then we discover over time that it turns into something we didn't anticipate. So my contribution to Game B, in part, was to recognize that this was an evolutionary space, and it would therefore either fall victim to evolutionary forces that it was unaware of, or take advantage of evolutionary forces that it could be made aware of.
Why do you think that name particularly stuck?
Again, as I said earlier, if you're unhappy with the status quo, then Game B has to be what the status quo isn't. So better the devil I don't know than the devil I know.
And what was the need for the Emancipation Party and then Game B? How would you sort of summarize that? Because Daniel Schmachtenberger, for example, talks about a kind of self-terminating system. And do you agree with that, or how would you frame the need for the whole movement?
I would say the Emancipation Party was not that way, really. We thought that the political and economic systems could collapse from their own internal contradictions, but we were not yet focused on bigger questions about, is our social operating system literally heading for suicide? I would say those conversations became part of the discussion in the Game B world, though probably weren't dominant. I think the dominant sense was that the world was not good. Not say particularly the Western world was not good. And in fact, one of the, I think, more succinct statements about Game B was the purpose of Game B is to create a society that we'd actually like to live in and would be proud to leave to our children. And we would say we did not believe that Game A met either of those criteria. So it was really more driven by the fact that we did not think the current Game A produced the best life for people.
Yeah. Who came up with the name Game B?
That's an interesting question. As I said earlier, in fact, I actually found on Basecamp that Thor was the first to propose it as the branded name of the movement. So at one level, to say that the person who said we should call what we're doing Game B is Thor Muller. However, it's quite possible, in fact I'm pretty sure it was, that the terms Game A and Game B as just generics to differentiate between the status quo and whatever's coming next, almost certainly were floating around. In fact, we're certainly floating around in the conversation prior to that. So who said the word Game B first? I don't know. Could well have been Jordan. At least one person thinks it was Bret Weinstein. Could have been Thor, but not sure. But I would give Thor the nod of proposing it as the brand.
And what were the specifics that were talked about at the meetings? What sort of, because Game B, as you said, it's like a placeholder. It doesn't actually mean, it just means an alternative to Game A. So what were the sort of solid ideas that were being shared at the meetings that...
There were long lists of them, which would come and they would go. Unlike the Emancipation Party, which was very disciplined, that worked up to 10 carefully defined reforms, which are written about exhaustively on the website, Game B was much more amorphous, and ideas came and ideas went. But as I said, the core three were non-hierarchical. It was very strongly a value that traditional top-down command and control organizations were not about what Game B is. In fact, I would say that in Neo Game B terms, that has been resurrected in a stronger form, which is, Jordan likes to say, Game B will not manage the complex via the complicated. Complicated meaning things with many highly defined moving parts, like a corporation. The second was net-centric, that again fits closely with non-hierarchical, that there would be essentially fractal scale of organization and people intercommunicating with each other as peers. In fact, this is something that unfortunately has not come back in Neo Game B. We had the name peers, what we called each other. We were all peers, kind of like comrade, right? So you were a Game B peer if you were a member of the the Facebook or the Basecamp inner circle. We talked about self-actualization as, from Maslow's hierarchy as one of the pole stars for what a good society was. So what is a society that we'd like to live in and leave to our children? Is a society where self-actualization is the highest value, not he who dies with the most toys wins. Where some of the fracture started to come in Game B was there was one sub-faction that believed changing yourself first was primary. And then there was another faction that believed that creating new institutions like a better monetary system, better sense-making capabilities, permaculture for food, co-housing was definitely something people were interested in as a piece part towards Game B. So the building the piece parts and the institutions versus changing as a person was a vision that started to become clear in May and actually grew and grew and grew until it eventually was probably the main vision that caused the community to kind of set upon itself in a not too pleasant way. And so there were people working on the what does it mean to change yourself direction, and then there were people thinking about these various piece parts, and many of them by this point not the party anymore, but again things like co-housing, permaculture, etc., or monetary systems independent of a political party.
So from what I understand, there were 5 meetings at Stanton, and there was a 6th that was planned, but it never went ahead because the sense was that there wasn't enough alignment among the people who were going to be there to make it worthwhile. What was your experience of that time? What did you feel happened?
Well, in some sense, I don't know why we ever expected anything different to occur. So I don't even take it as evidence that we did something wrong, that Game B came apart. What I think is true is that if you are embarking on a project as ambitious as we were, then you should expect to fail many, many times. And each of those times, it is incumbent on you to figure out what went wrong and to reduce or eliminate the chances of that same failure happening again. It's a classic question of prototyping. And in this case, we were prototyping 2 things. We were trying to design a set of rules for civilization that might work going forward, but we also needed to design a set of rules for how we would interact over this question that would work. And it was that second thing that came apart on us. I was hard on the Game B community after it came apart because I thought it did not do a great job. In fact, it really didn't do any job of analyzing the particular breakdown so that were there a Game C could profit from the knowledge of what had happened to Game B, and maybe we'd get to, Game LMNOP, who knows, before we would actually figure out how to do it right, but that would be an absolutely worthy investment. What happened is we left the space in a situation where it was as likely to suffer the same failure as a new one, and that meant that we weren't likely to make progress. We were basically, in evolutionary terms, waiting for a hopeful monster rather than learning from our mistakes.
So what do you think are the key lessons or the key realizations that you think are really important to know?
Well, I have an overarching one, which is quite live for me at the moment because I'm watching the Game B space come into public consciousness. And I feel like there is an error, and there's some awareness of this, although I don't think the awareness is what it needs to be. There is some danger of imagining that Game B is or could be an organization or a plan for civilization going forward. I don't think it can be, and I think any attempt to make it either of those things is going to result in, at best, a simple failure, and at worst, something potentially monstrous. So what I'd like to see is the recognition that Game B is actually fairly easy to define. It is, the virtue of it is that it is not a highly elaborate description of anything. It is a very basic sketch of something. And that what that sketch ought to do is it ought to set in motion many projects. Once people understand what it is that needs to be achieved in order to save humanity from the trajectory that it's currently on, then in principle, anybody can attempt to describe some mechanism that moves in the direction of Game B. And I would point out that this doesn't have to be at the scale of civilization. Really, we have dozens of problems in society. We have problems with healthcare, we have problems with education, we have problems in our courts, we have problems with homelessness and everything else. And what I would like to see, in addition to a large number of groups tackle the question of what a Game B might look like across civilization, I would also like to see people tackling the question of, well, what is the Game B solution for, let's say, city planning and traffic? What is the Game B solution for medical care? All of these things. Each of them is ripe for its own Game B solution. And if you, for example, came up with Game B for education, which is a project I'm actually working on with Heather, that would in and of itself be a major contribution. And if you solved something, if you came up with Game B for education, that obviously becomes fertile ground. It becomes a place to discuss the larger question of civilization. So Game B is a set of parameters that describes a superior future state, and it can exist at all scales. In other words, if you had an overarching Game B, it would be composed of lots of little Game Bs. So I'd like to see the space recognize that the thing to do is not to gather around Game B itself and figure out, who the voices of Game B are. The thing to do is to recognize that Game B is a statement about a design space, and then for people to create initiatives that function inside that design space and attempt to produce either a viable something or other, or a kind of knowledge about what doesn't work and why.
And you mentioned that there's a basic sketch of what the Game B space needs to look like. Do you want to sketch that out for us?
Sure. Well, the first recognition about Game B is that it has to be competitively superior to our system. And this is a difficult thing to swallow. Once you recognize that even if you described a wonderful future state that would be terrific for people, and you presented it, there is no pathway for it to find its way into the structures that make up civilization. In other words, the description is not sufficient. What's worse, if you turn it over to democracy and you allow us to try to vote it into place, it will be so butchered along the way by people who have their personal reasons to get in the road that it will be unrecognizable and almost certainly, again, either a failure or worse by the time it makes it into structural space. What we need to do is we need to look for something that has the characteristics of the smartphone, right? So the smartphone took over civilization, not because anybody told us you have to have a smartphone, but because for each of us, there were reasons that we wanted it. It enhanced our lives. And to take two obvious examples, the smartphone camera is now the most popular camera on Earth by orders of magnitude. And it is actually making photography into a much more widespread, I hesitate to even call it a hobby. It's something almost all of us do some fraction of the time. And so the ability to have a highly capable camera, and what's more, even a video camera in your pocket, just changes the way we live. It means that really at any moment that I want you to see what I'm seeing, I can capture it and I can send it to you instantly, really. So that's a remarkable capacity. Likewise, the ability to drop into almost any city on Earth and find a location that I want to be and dead reckon my way there with the help of a navigation device. These are spectacular characteristics. So those sorts of things caused us all to embrace this technology. Now, unfortunately, the underlying businesses that make the phone and that populate it with apps, those businesses are overwhelmingly Game A entities. And so unfortunately, it's a Faustian bargain. And this device that makes us so marvelously capable is now hell-bent on addicting us to counterproductive behaviors and everything else. So it's not as if the cell phone is a Game B device. But what it is a demonstration that if something empowers you enough, people will embrace it without having to be told that they need to embrace it, or without anybody voting it into existence. It just simply takes over by virtue of competitive superiority. So characteristic one of Game B is that it is competitively superior, so that people will embrace it, not because we tell them to, but because they know it's good for them to participate. Something like that can sweep over civilization relatively easily. The second characteristic is really, it comes in two forms. The structure has to at least be robust, and maybe at first that's all it could be. But ultimately, the Game B structure has to be anti-fragile. That is to say, that challenge causes it to become stronger rather than weaker. And this is a characteristic of most evolutionary systems. So it has to have that characteristic, or it won't persist through its early phases. Ultimately, it has to be what we would call an evolutionarily stable strategy. An evolutionarily stable strategy is a strategy that is not displaceable by alternatives. So in other words, if some parasitic strategy or some competitive strategy emerges and challenges a Game B structure, the Game B structure has to be robust and it has to defeat it. So this is an analog of the competitive ability to sweep civilization and the ability to remain in place. Those two things go together. And then the last set of characteristics have to do with what Game B would achieve. And I would claim that there are a set of values that almost any person who is not authoritarian-minded would agree are highly desirable in a society. So things like fairness, security, protection from catastrophic risk, these sorts of things are relatively easy to get people to agree to. And I've tried this experiment many times. I've asked rooms full of people I don't know how they feel about these things. And what you discover is that we all really agree on the list of things that civilization should accomplish. What we disagree over is an analysis of where we stand in that project, how good our society is at, for example, giving people fair access to the market. And we disagree on the priority, the ordering of these things that we would dictate. In other words, some people would prioritize safety over freedom, and others would prioritize freedom over safety, and both of those are defensible positions, so we don't necessarily expect everyone to agree on them. But the fact that the list of things that a good society would accomplish is relatively easy to get agreement on is very hopeful, because it means we can paint with a broad brush what we are trying to accomplish with relative ease. And there's another thing that works in our favor here, which is that in a complex system with an objective, right? So there are complex systems like weather in which there is no objective, but in a complex system with an objective like society, there are automatically diminishing returns with respect to each of the objectives that can be labeled. And what that means is that you can achieve a large fraction of an objective, but the closer you try to get to perfection with respect to it, the larger the costs in terms of other values. So what this means is that if we can agree on the list of things that a Game B world would achieve, and we can agree that we don't want 100% on any of them, but what we want is the lion's share of all of them, we can have that. And the folks who prefer safety over liberty can probably have their life biased in that direction, and those who prefer liberty over safety could probably have their lives biased in the direction they prefer, and there wouldn't have to be an important conflict about those things, because everybody would get the majority of everything that they were looking for.
And with the initial Game B community, what were the failure points of that particular organisation? I've spoken to a few people, and they've said that there was a big split around the idea of kind of personal growth and systems change or institutions. Is that true? Is that what you saw play out?
I did see it play out. I'm not sure I agree on what the question is, because maybe I just simply fall out with the systems folks. But I believe that the spiritual dimension is important, but I believe that it is an outgrowth of a system that is actually well enough architected to free you to explore that. And exploring it in the space of design is nonsensical. It is putting the cart before the horse, as it were. So I'm very much interested in seeing a world that addresses that problem. I'm not so sure that Game B discussions themselves need to address that problem. And in fact, I gave a talk many years ago on what I called the personal responsibility vortex. And the personal responsibility vortex was about the wrong-headed idea that one fixes the world through behaving in a personally responsible way that will then scale up. And in fact, the exact opposite is true. If you hold people to live the values that they would like to see fit civilization, then the best people will be hobbled by their level of obligation to, for example, sustainability, and they will have very little impact on the way the world comes to look. And those who pay no attention to sustainability will have lots of extra resource and freedom with which to shape the world to their objectives. So if you want to see the world look a particular way, holding people to that exact standard in the moment seems right, but the counterintuitive truth is it's dead wrong and will be counterproductive.
But you did see that split play out in terms of the direction or the would you agree that was the major split between the two different camps within Game B when it split?
Well, I certainly saw that conflict, and I guess I would say one has to figure out how, at the moment that split emerges, and it's not the last time it will be seen in any space that aspires to this sort of thing, it's likely to be seen. But at the point you have those two camps, the obvious thing to do is to divide them and say, look, you can't solve the systemic issue by, some sort of personal exploration. It doesn't invalidate personal exploration. Personal exploration is wonderful. But if you want to go do that, then that's either a tax on the systems discussion, right? Or it belongs separated from it. So why don't you do that? And, I'd be perfectly happy to see people who were interested in that, maybe even primarily interested in that, but also have an interest in the systems discussion, to come participate in a systems discussion. But the systems discussion is not the place for that exploration. It may be a place to discuss how you would make civilization hospitable to such explorations. But as I've said elsewhere, in order to have a compassionate society, you have to do a dispassionate analysis of the various problems that prevent it so that you can address them. And so I think this is counterintuitive to people. I know it is. But when you hear people being dispassionate, it is not a failure of their emotional structure. It is a proper corralling of that structure so it doesn't get in the road of creating a system that in the long term fosters exactly the thing that those who are focused on personal growth would like to see.
Yeah, what do you think were some of the reasons? You said that it kind of collapsed or it fell apart. Could you talk a bit more about what the tensions were within the community and why you think that happened?
In my view, and I would say this is not canonical, just my view, is there were two visions that are not quite entirely orthogonal with each other, but are different. There was, let's call it the institutions or tools first faction and the change yourself faction. And then there was an overlay of what I'd call woo versus anti-woo. Woo meaning belief in the supernatural, or what I would say, bullshit, right? And there were definitely a faction who, especially, I think they were all on the personal change side, who really got into what I would call woo, new agery, etc. But not all the personal change people were of that sort. Many of them were, personal change in other ways. And I think the final threshold which caused the death throes were a small group of people started to proclaim, or at least were perceived to be proclaiming, and this may or may not actually have happened, the perception might not have been accurate, or it may have been so hazy, it's hard to tell, that some form of woo should become mandatory. And that would be utterly unacceptable to both the anti-woo and the institutional faction. And I would say of the anti-wooers, yo is number one.
Can you explain what that means, that some form of woo will become mandatory?
Yeah, that you have to accept, for instance, that there's a cosmic consciousness, right? I don't believe in no goddamn cosmic consciousness till you can prove it, right? One of my favorite quotes that I like to use that I wrote is, when I hear the word metaphysics, I reach for my pistol. I am a hardcore scientific realist. I don't believe shit unless there's evidence, right? On the other hand, I don't rule things out either. I say, yeah, old Yahweh may actually exist. I think it's incredibly improbable, but until someone can present evidence that Yahweh exists that's independently reproducible, I am not going to believe in Yahweh, right? Nor am I going to believe in cosmic consciousnesses or any of that kind of horseshit.
But can you unpack what that means, that some people wanted that to be compulsory?
Yeah.
What did that look like, and who was that involved?
So again, there was at least a sense, and again, maybe we overreacted, that there was a small number of people who were proposing that Game B should include a metaphysical statement about reality beyond scientific realism. I guess that's the way to say it. Let's say, for instance, that there is a cosmic consciousness.
So why did Staunton 6 not happen?
I think the decohesion of the community across all these various lines, including people interested in the party still, which there were still a few, those interested in institution building, those interested in personal change, those interested in woo metaphysics, and people started getting mad at each other, for promoting their point of view. And the system decohered, I think is the best way to describe it. And at that point, we said, no point in bringing people together so we can just have a fight. And so it never happened.
When the initial sort of Stanton meetings stopped, I know Jim said that it was basically going into spore mode, that a lot of the original people went off and did their own projects, and it seems that those spores, or at least the kind of the meme of Game B, is now getting a lot more attention. There's like Facebook groups, it's got some presence on Twitter, it's sort of growing up. One, has that surprised you at all? And two, actually just one, has that what do you make of the kind of the resurgence of interest in this area?
Well, I see it as a result of a couple of different things, and one of them I had some involvement in. I mentioned Game B at some length on Joe Rogan's podcast, and I know that there was a flurry of interest that came from that. So in one way, it can't surprise me too much because I was sort of hoping to see it and went about talking about it publicly. Now, even at the point that I was talking about it on Joe Rogan's program, there was already a kind of organic, I think slower growing movement on Facebook and elsewhere. I have been reluctant about participating in it for various reasons, but nonetheless, I'm not surprised that something has emerged. I'm a little bit startled by the way I hear Game B discussed, and I feel like the energy that one of the things that worked in our favor in the Game B discussion was the fact that we were nobody to anyone, right? This was an invisible discussion. And because it was an invisible discussion, we had the capacity to explore down different avenues without worrying so much about what it meant. And now that there is sort of a public awareness in certain circles about Game B and Stanton and all of these things, I think there's a tremendous danger of the idea being, captured would be the worst way it could fail. The more likely way is it could evolve in some direction that is counterproductive.
Do you want us to talk a bit more about that?
It is very difficult to distinguish between people who earnestly believe something and espouse it because of their earnest belief, and people who discover that espousing that belief puts them ahead. And it is 100% inevitable that people who see the Game B discussion as an opportunity will find their way there and will say the kinds of things that get people to nod along, and that thing, that momentum, can take a movement that is highly generative and can swamp it with something else. And I really don't have any interest in participating in the something else. The question is, we actually faced this question at the end of the Stanton meetings, which was there was a desire to increase the size of the discussion, which I think everybody agreed was a good idea. But there was this sort of rush to bring people in, and I tried to caution at the time that a single error is very costly. So you may bring in 10 generative people, there may be diminishing returns on your generative people. In other words, a lot of what they bring to the table may already be in the room. But one mistake, right? One bad actor or one person who is motivated by what I would call social truth rather than analytical truth can cause tremendous havoc. And so I thought we were making an error in a couple of different ways. One, I thought that the idea that the organization moved from being the Emancipation Party into being Game B, that turned out to be an error pretty clearly. Game B is not an organization. It should never be an organization. And the Emancipation Party rightly was. It made sense as one. So there should have been a relationship between those two things. And what I'm getting at is, instead of doing what we did, which was decide that the Emancipation Party was a non-starter, I think 2016, the election in the US and what you saw in Britain with Brexit in 2016 tells us that actually there was room for some sort of an alternative party. And if the Emancipation Party had stuck it out from 2013, who knows what might have happened. But the Emancipation Party, at the point that we decided it was not the right moment in history for the Emancipation Party, should have become a sub-project of whatever the organization was functioning towards a Game B objective. That's not what we did. We decided the Emancipation Party was no more. We decided that this was Game B, which was an error. Then we decided to increase who was in the room, which took whatever tensions were already there, be they tensions between the spiritual and the systematic or whatever, and it made them worse. So one thing I would advise anybody attempting to build a Game B entity is to figure out how to insulate things that are functional from things whose impact you don't yet know. So, in other words, some capacity to go in reverse or to change direction, or some isolate that can be preserved if your decision that you've just made turns out to have been a mistake. And we didn't do that. We just simply decided the organization should grow, and that would have been fatal if nothing else was.
And you mentioned coherence as one lesson that maybe can be learnt from it. What do you think the other lessons are, especially now that there's a kind of resurgence of interest in the whole Game B space? What should people take on board?
Yeah, coherence for sure. And second, and this would be perhaps controversial, is that institutions do matter, and that Neo Game B, once it decides to get beyond being a talk shop, should build some early institutions on how to do things. A justice system, which we eventually did build in late Game B, called the ad hoc justice process. And then when there was a call to build a formal justice process, it never got done. But some preliminary institutions, but that are known to be contingent, and that they're not well formed yet, and that they're subject to amendment. So it needs to have an amendment meta process. So I would strongly suggest at some point that a line be drawn, at least a minimal set of bootstrap institutions come into existence. Third, that the onboarding process be more rigorous, or at least, they're fairly rigorous in Game B, but that it be tuned for coherence rather than too much exploration. Or I'll take that back. A balance between coherence and exploration. The Game B, late Game B, was too much exploration, not enough coherence.
And you also said earlier on that you think there's a danger in coherence.
Yes. I mean, what is ultimate coherence? A cult, right? Or a dictatorship. So I see that coherence is hugely important, but I would say absolute coherence, i.e. lack of coherent pluralism, is even worse than no coherence. Or, you could argue whether North Korea is worse than anarchy. I don't know. They both suck, right? And that's North Korea, extreme coherence, pure anarchy, no coherence. And so where you want to be is somewhere in the middle, with a thoughtful, nuanced balance of where you are, and make it. This is the coherent core. We all agree we believe this, or if we don't, we're not part. And an explicit statement that anything that's not in the core is pluralistic. Until through some institutional process, we may find some new things we want to add to the core. We also, through an institutional process, may want to take some things out of the core. Spore mode. So, spore mode refers to mushrooms. The real mushroom lives underground or in rotten wood, etc. And then the so-called fruiting body is the thing that we see and that we eat. And typically it grows up and then it fruits, which are typically spores, which are tiny, tiny, tiny little seeds, which often get blown by the wind a long way. And mushroom spores can often exist for many, many years if the conditions aren't right before they sprout. And when the conditions are right, then they sprout and a new mushroom grows. So that was the model I decided to use sort of at the end of active Game B. We're going into spore mode. Everyone is we're going to disperse our spores, i.e. our people, out into the world, and they'll continue to do whatever it is they do. And perhaps in a different time, in a different climate, and as the world's changed and as things have been learned, some of those spores will take root again and grow new mushrooms.
And so in the last few months, that seems to be happening. Do you want to tell us what's going on now?
Truthfully, I can't even tell you for sure. But we've noticed a tremendous upsurge in interest in Game B in, I guess, what are we in October? So it was certainly happening in July, June, July. I haven't truthfully tracked back the traffic. I think some of it was some of the podcasts that have been done. Jordan and Daniel Schmattenberger have been on podcasts. I was on a few podcasts. I think my own interviews of Jordan and Daniel may have helped. But something happened in that June, July timeframe, and Game B seems to be spreading, and groups of people we don't know or weren't connected to are doing really good work. Particularly the Twitter Game B. I was talking to Jordan about that a couple of days ago. And I said, we didn't know any of those people. They had somehow, come upon all of our various works and been actively working them, and they've created these very interesting online Google Docs which point to all kinds of references and take extracts from podcasts and essays and things, and it's really amazing. It's very Game B-ish, right? Non-hierarchical, network-centric. And maybe it's metastable and lasts a long time, we'll see. So there's a community on Twitter. There's a community with hashtag GameB, probably the easiest way to find them. And there's a very rapidly growing community on Facebook in the Facebook group GameB. And make sure you answer the 3 questions, damn it, if you apply for membership, because you will not be let in if you don't answer the 3 questions.
And what do you make of this current upsurge? Did it take you by surprise, or what are you seeing? What do you think how does it look to you?
It's a very excellent question. Now, surprise about any given time, yes, right? Because one of the things we learn from a complexity systems perspective is the trajectory of a complex system is exceedingly difficult to predict. However, you may be able to predict some averages across ensembles of trajectories. And so when we put Game B into spore mode, I might have said there was 50% chance it'd come back to life someday, right? But when, I had no clue. And the fact that it seemed to have come back to life this summer, I would not have predicted in advance. I mean, that's typical complex system story. Phase transitions, as we call them, are typically unpredictable. And so a phase transition seems to have occurred, and it's now self-generating and probably growing with an exponential, with some exponent greater than 1, which means if you wait long enough, it'll conquer the whole world. But how long that exponent will remain greater than 1, I don't know. But it's actually quite interesting. And the fact that I like it about it is that it is very Game B. It's bottoms up, nobody dictating what Game B is, people kind of collectively creating it. Though, as I said earlier, I do believe at some point they need to build some institutional structures in there to keep the problem of the previous problem of decoherence from occurring.
Mm. And, I mean, you mentioned the names Jordan and Daniel, and so a lot of the energy at the moment is around that particular kind of conception of Game B.
I think it's fair to say that...
What do you make of that?
Yeah, I think it's fair to say that the most actual work that has been done on Game B since 2014 has been done by what I call the San Diego configuration, or the San Diego group, which is Jordan Hall, Daniel Schmattenberger, Forrest, what the hell's his name? Forrest Landry, and various and sundry other folks. And they've done some very good work. Forrest has done some really interesting work on how to run organizations without rigid hierarchies, how to go from culture to operating entities and back again. Where does consensus work? Where do other forms of things work? Daniel's done some great exploration. He hasn't come to any answers, but he's put some very significant flags out on what a new economics might look like. Jordan's done a lot of good theoretical work on what does this all mean from a larger perspective. And so I say they've done a really good body of work. However, they'll be the first to admit they have done nothing like the definitive answer, what is Game B? They've essentially put out a series of piece parts and partial philosophical perspectives, but there's still a tremendous amount to be done. And I will say they've been exemplary in not claiming that they have defined Game B. They've been very upfront about, we've done our piece, other people have to do theirs. Now, one thing that I would disagree with them some is their approach, is they seem to be consciously taking a let's go slow and keep it somewhat private for now perspective. I brought forth the quote that the perfect is the enemy of the good. And I would say our world is in sufficient need for more good, that my own biases, and they are biases, I have no idea if I'm right, is to move things into the world sooner, where they're critiqued by other people and where they're tried. And I think that's, my own philosophy of Game B, that it is very experimental and exploratory. We don't know, and trying to can all the answers in advance is a fool's errand. By the time you spent 10 years doing it, you're going to then go out in the real world and find out 80% of it was wrong. To my mind, at least, and again, it's a different approach than the San Diego crew. I'd say, let's take a reasonable, rough set of ideas, build a minimum viable product, launch it, maybe fail, tune it, relaunch it. And to my mind, that's a better way to explore a vast space that is really difficult to parse in advance until you actually engage the world.
One of the lessons that I try to teach my children is that you need to develop a deep relationship with the idea of prototyping. That prototyping is the way you learn to accomplish something you do not know how to do. And the mythology around the construction of things does not pay nearly enough attention to prototyping. So if we look at the United States as a project, we might come to the conclusion that it is a failed project. If we look at it as a prototype, then we can say, well, this was actually a wildly successful prototype that eventually showed what about the design wasn't quite right. It is definitely time for a 2.0 version of something. What's more, it has to be a 2.0 version of something that does not require the collapse of what is. Somehow we have to seamlessly move from our prototype to something that is more capable and stable without this one coming apart. That's why I make this point about competitive superiority and sweeping across civilization without having to win power and change the structures in some sort of more direct way. I guess one final point I would make is I think there's a tension that I'm sure it's been described in many places, but I haven't seen it described with full breadth anywhere, which is that those things which are the most capable are always fragile. Okay? To the extent that we wish to have conversations that can reach greater heights, those conversations are absolutely vulnerable to being disrupted by anybody who doesn't want them to happen, right? So high capacity and vulnerability go together in a way that's not how we imagine it. Typically, we think that something that is highly capable is also very strong rather than very vulnerable. What we're talking about is a discussion in which we are able to see what might be possible for civilization and how it might be architected to be anti-fragile and evolutionarily stable in the end, but that discussion itself will be fragile. It has to be protected, and protected from all kinds of things that threaten it, which means things like naivete. It has to be protected from bad actors. It has to be protected from people who are looking to use it as an avenue to propel themselves somewhere. All of these things threaten it, and they all necessitate that you be able to take a conversation that's functional and shield it, right? Shield it from anything which challenges it so that it can wrestle with things and it can make errors and it can fall down and get back up again rather than suffer whatever fate it would suffer if just left to the whims of the populace.
This feels like a very natural segue into the intellectual dark web conversation, which we could also maybe see as a prototype.
Absolutely.
Because one last point on this that I wanted to raise, it's something that references something that you and Eric talked about in the Rubin report, where you talked about how truth cannot survive the encounter with market forces, which I think is a really valuable frame to look at the sort of game A, game B conversation, especially because I saw in the Game B Facebook group, someone said, well, what is Game B journalism? And I thought about that for a while, like that's my area of interest. And I thought, well, at its best, journalism is Game B.
It has to be.
In the same way that academia is Game B. And so if you realize that, it's like, that they have to be, like, Game B, journalism should be about pure, like truly ethical information. So if you have any kind of allegation, you've got to put it to the person, get their response. You're supposed to get all the views of everyone before doing your story. So that, as a case study, journalism and academia, why are they failing, is probably as good a way as any to kind of look at, okay, what are the factors that are making suppose a Game B enterprise, what are the Game A factors that are making them fail?
So I think another way to look at this is that there are many things that exist where we increasingly only know their pathological form. And it is the conflation of the pathological form with the form itself that is so confusing. So the fact that there is almost no game B journalism means that we understand journalism to be this malformed, arbitrary, untruthful dispenser of information. But you're right. Journalism itself would be a game B enterprise, right? You report what's true in spite of its implications for you personally. That's the very definition of a game B enterprise. Likewise, education and science. These are not about discovering things that are good for you or profitable. These are about discovering things that are true and teaching people how to think about them. They would inherently be game B versions. Medicine, I mean, even, as much as the Hippocratic Oath may be a little bit antiquated at this point, it does reveal that at some level there was an understanding about what medicine's purpose was. Do we really doubt that the purpose of modern medicine is to make a profit for those who make the drugs and dispense the materials and all of the other enterprises within that scope? Its very purpose has changed, and it does a tremendous amount of harm to people in the moment because you can't have two purposes as your top priority. So, yes, game B, should something figure out how to bring us to such a world, we will discover that many of the forms that we've seen distorted are really permutations of something honorable that has been lost. So one of my concerns about the way the game B conversation is unfolding is that it is collapsing all of the conversations that might ultimately produce their own prototype into one conversation. And I don't see any way that that can end well. And we talked about this a little bit during the Stanton meetings. I raised the question about whether or not we were the only discussion of this kind, or whether there were 100 such rooms or 1,000. And it was clear to me, and I think many others, that it would have been wonderful had there been many such discussions, because only one of them has to work. The point of a game B is not for us to produce a world that will work. It's for somebody to accomplish it. And in some ways, best possible outcome for any individual is for somebody else to figure out how to get us there, because it really takes the pressure off, and it means you get to have the advantages of that wonderful world on the far side. But I think one of the things that we have learned in that discussion, and then us all fanning out from it, is that there aren't a lot of such conversations, and that there's actually probably a reason for that, which is that the way we are connected together today, there is a strong tendency for people who are like-minded enough to have thought their way down that road to some degree to coalesce into one discussion. And that tendency to coalesce into one discussion means that the chances of multiple variations on that theme resulting in one of them surviving and beating the odds is greatly reduced. So I am a little concerned. There are lots of people who are now in this game B space who are not at the Stanton meetings. And what concerns me is, people like Jamie Wheel and Daniel Schmachtenberger, is that instead of us all being in one conversation, wouldn't we be better off if those were separate nodes? And I'm not saying that we shouldn't be talking to each other, but the idea that it is all one discussion looking for one solution just reduces the odds of success all the more.
Isn't there a paradox then in that the more we talk about it, the more it becomes one discussion? So isn't talking about it kind of feeding that trend towards it being one conversation? Eric and I and Heather and I have a kind of mode that we go into when we discuss something that is very uncertain and on which something important rests. And it involves figuring out how to isolate your beliefs so that you can discuss them without them being altered,
all right? So in other words, there's some sort of a formalization in discussion about, all right, I'm going to lock down what I believe about this topic. You lock down what you believe about this topic. Then we're going to meet and we're going to discuss whether or not those are the same beliefs. If we turn out to have the same belief, then okay, that gives us increased confidence that there's probably something true about that belief. If we find out that we're actually in different places when we meet in the middle, then we step very carefully, because at least having formalized our belief before our position moves allows us to say, okay, I made a jump, right? That means if it turns out that down the road that jump was counterproductive, I can probably unmake that jump. I can remember what it was like to think that other thing beforehand. Whereas the natural tendency in informal conversation is for your position to move as you are persuaded. And unfortunately, many people are unduly persuaded by somebody else's intensity of belief. So it's a sort of a cultivated skill that you will avoid being persuaded by the fact that somebody that you like is very convinced of something. So what I would argue is that we have to have conversations, right? I mean, those people that we were discussing are connected socially. They will have discussions, and it is natural for those discussions to have some overlap with this territory. But maybe there needs to be some formalization around how to make sure that the conversations don't synonymize or average or whatever it is that they will tend to do, so that their independence from each other can be utilized. You know, in a functional academy, this would be the way different laboratories studying the same question would function. It would be the way different schools of thought behaved. There would be interaction between them, but there would also be enough insulation that we could sort of track the development of what happened. On the question of spore mode that Jim Rutt raised, whether at the end of the Stanton meetings the Game B entity dispersed to the wind and the independent nodes in that discussion were germinating the ideas. There's some potential truth in that, but I'm concerned that that's not really what happened, and that because the idea of Game B reawakened in the age of social media and YouTube, that what we have is an idea loosely defined that because there is a lot of energy around the idea of living in the better world that is loosely proposed in that definition, that the conversation is now developing in a space that not only has no proper rule set, but is also has no evolutionary history. We don't know that discussions like this are productive. Frankly, we don't know, and I think have strong reason to believe that were the founding fathers to have built the prototype that is the American experiment in the social media age, that it would not have worked well. So I think we need to be very careful about what it means. The spore mode is a very loose description of what happened, and what, as those spores germinated and were again in contact with each other through some network whose rules we don't understand, whether that doesn't immediately challenge the idea that they were spores and that they might grow apart into unique plants.
So what's your concern with the conversation as it exists now in social media age?
Well, I have to say I'm a little bit at a disadvantage talking about the conversation as it's actually happening, because I have stayed out of it. And I've stayed out of it for some very intentional reasons and then some other reasons that were just a happenstance. The intentional reason is that I have seen the power of beliefs persuade people of fictions. And I know this process to be very difficult to resist if you were in those conversations day in and day out. So they kind of, your belief system gets chiseled away at just by virtue of the fact that lots of people are repeating something that you just lose the ability to protect. So I've stayed out of it in part because I don't think the conversation is productive enough to justify that hazard. The independence of thought is valuable enough to be worth staying out. And then, of course, there's the circumstances that unfolded around my exit from Evergreen, which made Facebook in particular an almost impossible place for me to tolerate. So I had been a user of Facebook, I was never enthusiastic about it, but I had been a user of Facebook, and at the point that Evergreen came apart, I stepped away from it, and I really haven't been able to go back just by virtue of what sort of discussion it is. So I can't speak to the particulars of the discussion, but I can say in general, a large free-form discussion in which people gather as a result of the appeal of some concept, those discussions are not likely to be highly fruitful because the curation that has to go on at the door in order to create one of these highly generative but fragile conversations needs to be better than that. But if we define freedom in terms of how much liberty you actually have that you can act upon, right, that you can engage in the real world, then we will discover a couple of things. One is that if you have achieved great deals of realized freedom, that you have probably achieved all of the other goals and balanced them in a way that is desirable.
What are your biggest takeaways when you look back on that time and you sort of look at where we're at now? What are your biggest takeaways? What do you look back and think?
I think we were damn prescient that things would get worse, which they certainly have. We were a little prescient about the fact that we were rapidly approaching the limits of the ecosystem. But I think that was one area where we were not as prescient as we could have been. And so that's interesting. I think that it highlights to me the tremendous failure of organizational design and dynamics above all else. And that's why I think the Forrest Landry work may well be critical to Neo Game B succeeding or failing, or if not his, then somebody else's. But I should say, and this is very important, that in these high-dimensional complex systems, you cannot say in advance whether X will work. You've got to take an experimentalist perspective. You've got to try it, and I know he believes this as well. He wants to try it on 2 groups, relatively small, then larger groups, etc. So all these tools and techniques, the piece parts for which we will build Game B, have got to all be taken from an empirical, experimental perspective, tried and see if they work. And if they do, then that we vet that they are suitable for at least the early stages of Game B. And maybe it turns out they're only good for up to 2,500 people, then you have to rethink it. So I would strongly suggest to those interested in Game B, stay light on your feet, don't make over-strong commitments to anything. When things stop working, pitch them and try something else.
Mm. Yeah, I think that's kind of my last question is what advice would you have for people just discovering this kind of space or the Neo Game B? Where did it go from here?
That's an excellent question. You know, there's, I think, probably a couple of different directions. One is because of the nature of the foundations of Game B, it will be a talking shop forever. There will be people bloviating about various and sundry Game B related topics, both allegedly practical and others purely theoretical forever. It's built into the DNA. And if you want to bloviate, you can find fellow bloviators till the cows come home. On the other hand, I would suggest it's time for more doers to show up, and particularly on Twitter Game B. There are people now pounding the table. Let's do something. Let's do something. And for people who like to do things, I'd suggest find the other doers and go do something, and realize it ain't going to be perfect the first time out of the chute. And even just experiment with the piece parts. You don't like public schools, which is one of the I think relatively consistent beliefs in the Game B community. Then build a charter school in your community and use your ideas, see how they work, and make sure they're informed with Game B ethos. And if it works, report back. That's I think the key part. Do experiments, report back, and report your failures and your successes.
Yeah. You just gave the example of education here. What are the other sort of solid concrete ideas that came out of this?
Or things that needed to be solved, whether they were Actually, frankly, did we do anything useful on them? No. But did we talk a lot about them? Yes. Well, how to build and run an organization? We identified that as absolutely critical. Education, health, and distinguishing that from health care. Right? We in the United States way too much talk about health care when really what we want is health. And that includes eating good food, exercising plenty, not being annoyed by being overstressed by your damn smartphone, and lots of things. So taking a holistic perspective on health was clearly a theme. Let's see, think out. And somewhat related to health was always a strong interest in food and clean food, local food. Food that could be, that was not overly refined, but was interesting and good and probably built, created by people you already knew. Housing was a big one. I said there was a foray into trying to understand co-housing. And we had a person, Lydia Lawrenson, who actually had been the manager of a couple of co-housing projects. She was a huge and wonderful resource, but that stimulated a big conversation. The sharing economy. We talked a lot about the sharing economy in 2013, a little bit prescient there. Things like tool libraries and perhaps joint ownership of cars and things of that ilk, again, to make people's lives less economically intensive and less environmentally intensive. Does everybody need a car? Fuck no. You just need N cars across M people for X missions, right? And it's probably a shitload less than the typical American who has, 2.7 cars and probably needs 1.1 on average. Maybe less than that. Can you consider how many, you drive your car to work and it sits there 8 hours. That's crazy, right? So we talked about a lot of these kinds of things. One that's arisen in Neo Game B, and in the next episode of the Jim Rutt Show, Jordan and I go over a fairly long list of these things. One of them is parenting. I think there's been a lot of interest in preschool age children. How do the parents and the children interact correctly? What is the right kind of home life for children? How do we help make sure that Game B children are well-balanced, joyful, productive, non-neurotic, etc. So I think that's an area there's a lot of interest in right now. The other one that's new since Game B 1.0, though we had kind of a hazy vision of it, is what's called sense-making. This is a key interest of a community that came right before Neo Game B called Rally Point Alpha, which you can check out on Facebook, the Rally Point Alpha group, which was triggered by an essay by Jordan and has tried to dedicate itself to understand how networked individuals can make sense of the world in a powerful fashion. Are we currently doing it? No. And there needs to be more things, including perhaps better tools. But sense-making is certainly a category of great interest in the Neo Game B world. And something we share with all the way back to the Emancipation Party is a strong interest in rethinking economics. The monetary system, banking, investment, rivalrous versus non-rivalrous economics. Those have been themes consistent all the way through. And I would particularly point people to Daniel Schmottenberger's essays that are pointing the way towards what a new economics might be. I guess I'll just reiterate one more time that for Game B to be real, at some point it has to make the transition from talk to action. And we can talk till the cows come home, but it's action that really changes the world.
Rebel Wisdom was set up to make sense of the world at a deeper level than the mainstream media. It was built for these times of crisis and change, which is why we want to do what we can to meet the challenge of the times. More films, and also for our Rebel Wisdom members, weekly sense-making calls with our amazing interviewees. And also, we're introducing the Wisdom Gym, a place to practice some of the skills that we've talked about on the channel. Thanks for watching, and see you soon.